Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first, let me declare an interest as a proud, lifelong trade unionist. And I regret at the start, Madam Deputy Speaker, the tone of the Secretary of State's response today, because to suggest or imply in any way that members of this House do not care about their constituents and put their constituents first, and that members of our vital public services that got us through the pandemic in some way do not take the safety of their people who they look after seriously and walk away. I think the Secretary of State should reflect on his comments today. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been a member of this House for some 7 years now, and I cannot recall a measure that is at once so irrational and so insulting. Not only is it a vindictive assault on the basic freedoms of British working people, but this legislation is as empty of detail as it is full of holes. So we will oppose the Sacking of Nurses bill, and not just nurses, Madam Deputy Speaker, but also many of the key workers who we clapped and who kept our services going in the face of the pandemic. And we will vote against it tonight. And the next Labour government will repeal it. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are in the middle of an economic crisis of the government's making. Working people are facing the largest fall in living standards in a generation. And the Secretary of State keeps shouting Putin, but what about Liz Truss? What about the Conservatives crashing the economy? What about the Conservatives crashing the economy? The Secretary of State forgets the fact that it's inflation that's gone through the roof under their watch, 13 years of Conservative failure. And members who are watching this debate and constituents up and down this country know the truth, Madam Deputy Speaker, and they will tell this government what they think come the next general election. But working people are facing the largest fall in living standards in a generation. In work poverty, insecure work and financial insecurity are rampant. Inflation in double digits. It's in this context that we've seen the greatest levels of strike disruption in 33 years. Ambulance workers taking their first major strike action in decades. The first ever strike in the history of the Royal College of Nursing. Our posties, train drivers, border force, health workers, train cleaners and even ministers' own officials have all taken action too. The Prime Minister won't admit it, but this is a crisis, and it's a crisis of their making. This legislation does nothing to resolve the problems that they have caused. There is nothing common sense about it at all, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll happily give way.
I thank my friend for giving way. I declare an interest as a proud trade union member. Will my honourable friend agree with me that this legislation does nothing to address the underlying reasons why the NHS staff and others have taken the incredibly difficult decision to strike? We're going to spend a number of hours in here this evening. Surely that time would be much better spent by the government getting around the table with members of the NHS, listening to their concerns and coming to some resolution that will help move things forward rather than wasting our time here this evening on this horrible piece of legislation.
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution. I absolutely agree, and I was reflecting whilst the Secretary of State was making his opening speech, and I was thinking, if I still worked in social care or one of these key public services, if I was a paramedic, if I was a nurse, if I was one of those key workers that the Secretary of State mentioned listening to this debate, I'd be really upset and offended by the way the Secretary of State represented them here today. And that's not what the Labour Party thinks of those key workers. And also the Secretary of State claimed that this legislation is about public safety. So why does the bill not mention safety once? He knows full well that working people already take steps to protect the public during strikes, with derogations and voluntary agreements, yet he brazenly claims this punitive legislation is needed because of ambulance workers. It's insulting and it's shameful and it actually I think he should apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the way in which he has represented ambulance workers who have been awfully smeared by the Secretary of State. I'll happily give way.
I thank my unison comrade for giving way, because I'm a proud trade unionist. I'm not a member of a CLP, but I'm a proud trade unionist. Can my good friend remind the House that under existing legislation, Section 240 of the 1992 Trade Union and Labour Relations Act guarantees that trade unions must provide and agree to life and limb cover during an industrial dispute, because failure otherwise could result in a custodial sentence, and this bill is completely, therefore, unnecessary.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and we may not be in the same party, but I know we're in the same trade union. But these brave, hard-working men and women struck local life and limb deals trust by trust basis ahead of all strikes. And the Secretary says trust by trust, but it is the best way to ensure the right care is provided. And those employers know that. Those employers know that. When I was a home help, we always put patient care first, and we did negotiate and make sure that there was minimum safety levels, which is more than I can say for the Secretary of State, where we've seen excessive deaths and our crisis in the NHS increasing under his watch.
Will she give way?
I'll happily give way.
Which one?
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I too declare an interest as a proud trade unionist and a trade union lawyer for many years before entering Parliament, representing striking workers day in, day out, and I know that no worker takes the decision to strike lightly, and these strikes have been caused by the cost of living crisis caused by this Conservative government. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this is just a further attack on workers' rights, like the 2016 anti-trade union legislation that this government introduced? It's just yet another attack on working people that keep us safe day in and day out.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I think people who have been watching this debate can see from the Secretary of State's opening remarks and his remarks previously what this is, and this smokescreen about allegedly needing these minimum service levels, when we know, because last autumn his own government assessed that minimum service levels weren't needed in emergency services due to existing regulations and voluntary arrangements. We all want minimum standards, Madam Deputy Speaker, and safety and service and staffing levels, and we want it every day, but it's the Minister that's failing to provide them. And instead of holding them to account, they seek in this bill to grab sweeping new powers to impose burdens on employers and remove basic rights from workers across our public service. An attack on every nurse, health worker and firefighter in this country. They've gone from clapping nurses to sacking them.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. I know that my mum is a member of the RMT, something that I've noted in this House before, and it's interesting to me what the Secretary of State has been saying about the need for this bill and the legislation more widely. When he was Secretary of State for Transport, in fact, the only negotiations that have not been settled with RMT are those that the Department for Transport is involved in, because actually every single other dispute with the RMT has been resolved. So is this bill not just covering up his own failure to negotiate basic trade union agreements?
Well, my honourable friend makes some very important points, and I think we can all see from the reports regarding the negotiations that there was genuine hope that we could get to a settlement, and then the government decided to bring in new conditions at the last minute to try and make sure that this was a continued dispute. It's the government that's acting in a militant way and doesn't want to resolve these disputes, not the trade union. And also, the government should reflect those key workers and the workers that will be affected by this strike action, who he says put people's lives at risk, are also usually, if it's not them who are the key workers, but I'm pretty certain that most people, like my honourable friend, are someone who's a relative or friend or someone who they know who does that job. And we all think they're heroes, and we all know that they put their patients and those people they look after and those services that they provide at the forefront of their mind. And no one wants to take strike action, least of all the workers who lose a day's pay. I have long urged ministers to do their own jobs and resolve the underlying problems, and instead they present a bill that tries to effectively remove the historic right to withdraw their labour from hundreds of thousands of workers. Now let's take the railways. The Secretary of State mandates that on strike days 50% of trains need to run. He knows that Network Rail may mandate that all signal operators will need to work. You need signals even if just 2 trains are running. How can the Minister say this does not remove their right to strike? I know many members opposite would say that they respect, even champion, civil liberties, and I'm sure that they mean it. But with this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, they are burning freedoms for which we've fought for centuries and handing to ministers unprecedented power over individuals that it targets. And it's not just wrong in principle, but it's unworkable in practice.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I declare my interest as a proud trade unionist in this House. I meet striking workers almost on a weekly basis at the moment, and I know that so often working people in dispute are targeted by employers, and what this bill does is hand the right to the employer to decide which worker goes to work and which worker can go on strike. Does my honourable friend share my concerns at how this can allow the victimisation and the targeting of workers by bad bosses?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend on that point. And this legislation is not a solution to dealing with the industrial action we see at the moment. Not my words, but those of the Transport Secretary in December. This bill could increase the frequency of strikes, numbers of staff taking action short of striking, and lead to employers finding they are low on staff. Again, not my words, but those of the Department of Transport's own impact assessment. Minimum service levels aren't a game changer and could promote more industrial action than they mitigate. Not me speaking, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the senior Conservative advisor who developed the policy. The jury is in. These measures won't work, can't work, and will only make things worse. I'll give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I please remind the House that we do have a number of sectors in the UK where employees are not allowed to strike, namely the armed forces and the police. These people, they always turn up, often at times of crisis. They work without complaint to provide minimum service levels, and they do it under pay and conditions that are often inferior to what the unions are currently demanding. So could I please ask the Honourable Lady perhaps to present an argument as to why this provision should not be extended elsewhere?
Well, I'm glad the honourable member got the crib sheet from the whips, but let's come on to the measures and the 6 sectors that this will apply to. But there's a complete and utter lack of clarity about what they would actually mean for those 6 sectors. Let's look at nuclear decommissioning, for example, where staff already have voluntary arrangements. How would ministers define minimum service in this sector? Will the minister require just a little teeny bit of decommissioning? And let's look at health. Is the minister seriously going to sack doctors, nurses and paramedics, as well as vital support staff, at a time of critical NHS staff shortages? Apparently not, if the government sources reported this week can be believed. And does the minister here deny that the Health Secretary has told others to lobby the Prime Minister for improved pay offers? And can he really say that the Health Secretary believes this bill will help the NHS? And let's look at transport. The bill states that all transport services will be covered, an industry that is largely in the private sector. Does he expect, for example, self-employed cabbies to serve work notices to themselves? And there seems to be a split here too, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hear that the Transport Secretary has given rail companies permission for new pay offers. Do we already know that, we already know that the member for the Forest of Dean's views on minimum service levels? Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, let's move on to education. Will our overstretched head teachers be forced to write and serve work notices in their own staff rooms? And does the Secretary of State agree with the Education Secretary that imposing these regulations on schools would be a hostile act? And let's turn to fire and rescue services. Hasn't austerity already made it impossible for some services to meet existing contingency regulations as it is? And will the Secretary of State leave it there, or will he just go for broke and ban all key workers from joining a union at all? Something we know his desperate Prime Minister has been considering. I'll give way.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for giving way, and she mentions the issue of pay and speaking with unions to resolve this dispute. Would the Right Honourable Lady be able to tell us what level of pay she thinks and the Labour front bench believe is appropriate? Would this be in line with inflation? Would this be more than inflation? And how exactly would Labour solve this dispute?
Well, I'll just educate the honourable member that whilst I used to be a trade union official and I'm a member of a trade union, I don't actually negotiate on behalf of the trade union. But what I would do is I would sit round the table and resolve this dispute with the trade unions, and that would be better than what the Conservatives have done. Now, on the liability of this bill that it places upon the trade unions, it says that trade unions must take reasonable steps to ensure workers comply with work notices. But what would that be? Will the trade unions be liable for non-union staff? As for the burden put on employers, have they welcomed the bureaucratic nightmare that they'll face? How will our already overstretched public services spare the resources to work out how many workers are needed to meet minimum service levels he arbitrarily imposes on them, to identify which workers should come in and into work and which shouldn't? And then what will they have to do it? Will they have to do it before each and every strike day?
Right Honourable Lady for giving way. I think I'd like to try again, because she does aspire to be Deputy Prime Minister and want to actually negotiate with the unions in future. Can she outline for the House, because the Labour Party have been very quiet on this, does she back, for example, a 19% pay increase for nurses? And what costing has her party put forward for how much she would award in pay rises to those public sectors?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, what I can say is the Labour Party wouldn't have crashed the economy like the Conservatives did. We wouldn't have inflation at record levels that we have at the moment, and we wouldn't have the disputes we have at the moment, because we would negotiate with the trade unions and find a settlement. And what protections are in place to stop unscrupulous employers from targeting trade union members with work notices, Madam Deputy Speaker? Or is this legislation a licence for blacklisting? Absolutely. He's hiding behind warped misunderstandings of the International Labour Organisation statute book and misleading comparisons with Europe. The ILO says minimum service levels can only happen when the safety of individuals or their health is at stake. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, can the Secretary of State explain how this relates to the list of the sectors in the bill? This bill also makes no provision for the compensatory measures that ILO requires alongside such regulations. And countries like France and Spain, Madam Deputy Speaker, may have minimum service levels, but they haven't averted strikes there. Exactly. Both lose far more days to strike action than the UK does. Exactly. This bill is a mess, Madam Deputy Speaker. It makes no sense. It's got more holes in it than the last Chancellor's budget. And yet we're being given next to no time to scrutinise it, Madam Deputy Speaker. This legislation hands far-reaching powers to the Secretary of State to not just impose minimum service levels, but also to decide what those levels would be. The legal commentator, Joshua Rosenberg, has called Clause 3 a supercharged Henry VIII clause. And where is the consultation the Secretary of State promised? Where is the impact assessment? The Regulatory Policy Committee says that they haven't even received it yet in a scornful statement today. So why is the government only given 5 hours debate on the floor of the House? Madam Deputy Speaker, let's look at what this bill is all about. A government that is out of ideas, out of time and fast running out of sticking plasters. A government that is playing politics with nurses' lives because they can't stomach negotiation. A government desperately doing all it can to distract from the economic emergency it has caused. We've had 13 years of failure and working people of this country can't take any more. What this whole sorry episode makes clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that this country needs a Labour government. The party opposite have proven themselves incapable of cleaning up their own mess, and the disruption of the past few months simply wouldn't be happening under Labour. I'll happily give way.
Thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. It's quite difficult to listen to the Secretary of State say that workers who have devoted their lives to life-saving, whether they're fire workers, doctors and nurses, accuse them of putting others at risk. It's a very difficult listen. Does she agree with me that the arguments that it's too expensive, that it's too difficult? And today, Oxfam announced that £21 trillion, or dollars rather, went into the pockets of the 1% internationally during the global pandemic. Does she agree with me that there is enough money, it's just in the wrong pockets?
Well, the Honourable Member makes some very, very important valid points. And also we've seen over the last 12, 18 months, 2.5 years, the unravelling of the VIP fast-track lane for the people linked to the Conservative Party in a waste of billions of pounds of money that could have gone into investment in our public services. And the public have seen 13 years of Conservative failure. Most of the public who are watching this debate today can ask themselves one question. Do they feel better off after 13 years of the Conservatives? And the answer to that question is no, unless, of course, you may be in that 1% with a WhatsApp number of a government minister. But Madam Deputy Speaker, in regards to these disputes, Labour would have resolved these disputes a long time ago by getting back around the negotiating table in good faith and doing a deal.
On a Labour government, is she aware that in Wales the Labour government was given over £1 billion for PPE and test, track and trace, and only spent £500 million? And if we'd had that level of savings instead of Tory crony donors putting their hand in the till, that would aggregate up to a saving of £11 billion against a total pay cost of the NHS of £56 billion. In other words, 20% of the annual pay for all nurses and all health workers. So doesn't she agree with me that if we had a Labour government, we'd have more money to provide decent wages for a health service?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Not only would we have grown the economy, and we've got a plan to grow the economy unlike the Conservatives, but we wouldn't have wasted billions of pounds and we wouldn't have crashed the economy like the Conservatives did. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government isn't working and this bill is unworkable. The Sacking Nurses Bill is one of the most indefensible and foolish pieces of legislation to come before this House in modern times. It threatens teachers and nurses with a sack during a recruitment and retention crisis. It mounts an outright assault on the fundamental freedom of working people while doing nothing, absolutely nothing, to actually resolve the crisis at hand. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, We on these benches will vote against this shoddy, unworkable bill. And I urge every member across this House who cares for fundamental British freedoms, who knows that the only way to resolve disputes is by negotiating in good faith, to join us in standing against it this evening.